Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I am so excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between one of our all-time favorites, Heather Havrilesky, and her conversation partner, Leslie Jamison. Thanks for attending. FAN is a nonprofit organization that brings a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice. We have over 175 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now for formal introductions of our favorite people. Heather Havrilesky writes the popular Ask Polly advice column on Substack and is the author of What If This Were Enough? How to Be a Person in the World and Disaster Preparedness. She has written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times Magazine, and NPR's All Things Considered, among others. And she also maintains the Ask Molly newsletter written by Polly's evil twin. We had the distinct pleasure of hosting Heather in 2018 in support of What If This Were Enough? And she also interviewed Melissa Phoebos for FAN last April in support of Melissa's then new book, Girlhood. Leslie Jamison is the New York Times bestselling author of 2 essay collections, The Empathy Exams, plural, and Make It Scream, Make It Burn, as well as a critical memoir, The Recovering, and a novel, The Gin Closet. She's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and teaches at Columbia University. We were honored to host Leslie for 2 events in 2019 in support of the launch of The Recovering. We are lucky to have this fantastic pairing of 2 brilliant writers who expertly, courageously share their personal stories. And now let's listen and learn.
Hi.
Hi, Heather. So great to be here. We're in a hotel room together. It feels really fancy.
It's very apt that my marriage memoir should be examined in a hotel room where so many marriages come together and also fall apart. We were thinking that maybe I would start by reading a little bit of my book. It's hard because all of the different chapters are sort of different, represent different eras in my marriage. But the beginning of the book, I feel like summarizes the mood of the book pretty well. So I'm going to start by reading.
Serve it up.
I'm going to start by serving it up. Here we go. Every book about marriage is also a book about mortality. Since the success of any marriage is defined not by happiness or good fortune, but by death. The assignment, after all, is to stay together until you die. Once one spouse perishes, the marriage has succeeded. Death signals victory. Only an optimistic fool would declare victory before reaching the finish line. That's what makes weddings such dark comedies. What's more entertaining and ominous than watching 2 naive souls sign a binding contract without understanding the fine print? Most engaged couples bumble onto the marital bullet train without even knowing where it's headed. All that matters is that we'll be together, they say to each other. Forever is 2 immortal elves sipping pink champagne by a burbling stream. Then exploring the wild, gorgeous woods around them in everlasting harmony. Forever is set in New Zealand, not New Jersey. Muddling through the first year of marriage has a way of turning New Zealand back into New Jersey, changing pink champagne into a juice box, and transforming 2 immortal elves into hungry, lumpy. Okay, I added hungry. I don't know why.
That's right.
Hungry, lumpy humans with a rapidly approaching expiration date. Even after many satisfying years together, married life has an uncanny way of making even the most buoyant soul feel like a fool and a failure repeatedly. It's a feature, not a bug. Marriage is designed to break you. You will forget everything you knew before. You will tremble under the weight of your own shortcomings. Sure, you might bounce back and proclaim yourself lucky and declare your marriage happy and become the masochist your marriage wants you to be. but you'll still wake up plenty of mornings wondering why you signed on to drag this wretched, snoring heap of meat with you everywhere you go until the day you die. It gets a little less dark, but I right after that, but we'll leave it there. Why not start with some suspense?
I'm still just stuck on the immortal elves. I feel like we are those elves right now, getting to sit here with our pink champagne. It's such a pleasure to get to talk to you about this book, Heather. And thanks, Lonnie and Fan, for doing what you do and bringing us here. I think it's the perfect way to set the mood of the book. And my first question, which I think also maybe gets into the terrain of the book, is from that opening chapter as well. There's this moment where you say, being married is far more interesting than falling in love. And I thought we'd start there because I'm also kind of interested in this question of like, what are the stories that we have these knee-jerk assumptions are compelling to tell? And then what are the stories that are maybe actually compelling to tell? And you make this really smart point that we have so many stories about falling in love and fewer stories maybe about like the long haul of staying in love. And so I just wanted to ask, like, what's more interesting about being married than falling in love? And how did you think about telling the story of marriage in a way that would get at what's so interesting about it?
Well, I've thought for a long time and have written for a long time about how our culture is obsessed with romance and how we're obsessed with the first few minutes that you encounter someone physically, which is understandable in a way, because it's sort of like before you consummate a relationship, it's delicious to obsess and fixate and focus on, will I be loved or not? Will I be accepted? Is it possible that this is my person and that we'll collide? It's like a Dave Matthews song in all of the good and bad ways. We'll collide and it will just blend I think in the book I say, it's like warring cells, two microbiomes clash, and there are these armies, almost like Lord of the Rings clashing in the night. And what will become of this? It's in some ways like, it's understandable that it's the most climactic part of the story. But my feeling is that it's also in some ways the most shallow part of the story, because you don't know the person yet. Just as I say, falling in love is New Zealand and being married is New Jersey. New Zealand is incredible, but I mean, how long can you stare at that statue and the Lord of the Rings that is gigantic? I mean, I could stare at it for a long time, actually. But, New Jersey, it's like learning to love a marriage is sort of like learning to love Jersey City. It's sort of gritty. And, it's like when I come to New York, we're in New York now. The ugliness of New York is so beautiful to me now. All I can talk about is how much I love New York at the moment. But a marriage just sort of feels like that. It's like you're in a relationship for a long time with New York, and then suddenly it opens up to you and you're excited about the little edges and the darkness and the grittiness appeals to you. So my idea with the book was to really explore what is romantic about putting up with someone, putting up with their sounds and their smells and the way they talk about things, and also enjoying their flaws, which I think has always sort of been a goal of mine and a stated purpose in my life, to be accepted for my flaws and to just embrace someone else's flaws. And I think as that drama unfolds, it gives you the texture of what love really is. It's like looking at a row of trash cans on the sidewalk in New York. It's sort of like you reach a point where you're like, look at those trash cans. They're beautiful. And that's kind of how it is to love someone for their flaws. It's actually kind of this sensual, beautiful thing where you're loving the whole person, which to me feels more soulful than just saying, you're hot, I'm hot, or, we want each other, let's do this, is like the first few seconds of the game.
Yeah, well, and it's when listening to you talk, and certainly when I was reading your book, I was thinking too about how you point out the ways in which, like, part of why falling in love is New Zealand is almost actually like, it's not even New Zealand, it's like your fantasy of New Zealand based on the Lord of the Rings novels, but there's actually something even a little lonely about falling in love, because you're still essentially in this encounter with yourself. You're in this encounter with your fantasy of what the other person is, and to be with the person is to encounter, as you laid out so eloquently in the book. And right now you're encountering genuine otherness, like somebody who makes all these sounds, makes all these smells, doesn't have the first same thought or same reaction you do, but you're kind of liberated from this more solipsistic relationship to like your fantasy of who this person will be. Instead, you're with like the person they actually are.
Exactly. And the fantasy of who they will be is actually dehumanizing to the person, right? I mean, it's like, this is what we do to each other. I say in our culture too much, but there's a way, unfortunately, I was a TV critic for years, and a book critic, and
honestly.
Yeah. And also when I was a little kid, I was a little obsessed with American culture. I read John Updike. I love John Updike. And John Updike wrote over and over again about how twisted and sort of alienating our culture is in such a beautiful way. And I feel like there's a way that when you want someone, it's not just that you're objectifying the person, which I don't really object to objectifying necessarily personally, but you want an image of them, like you said, that you're creating inside your mind. Like you've written a script and you're sort of like, you're imagining glory and magic. And I hate to reduce it to ego, because that's only one piece of it. A lot of times people talk about when you're falling in love, you just want someone to adore you and like success, I'm lovable. I think it's beyond that. It's sort of like, it's not just I'm validated. It's also like, this creature matches me, and I just know that we're going to have these moments of deep communion where everything is practically silent. Perhaps there's incredible music playing. We're both sort of cinematically exciting. We're just trained to consume love in a little bit of like a eat the whole bag of snacks way. And marriage is much more like, can you make it through an epic 16-course meal, in a giant hall where everyone's shouting at each other.
And like, what is it like the morning after you've eaten the entire bag of snacks? And you're like, then what is it like between you and your person?
Yeah. Do I want to live in this kingdom? Who killed this beast? And do I have to get involved? Who are these other people that got dragged into this hall with me? I mean, there are layers and layers of it. And in some ways, writing this book was a difficult thing because I was intrigued by the challenge of it, because capturing a marriage is like, it's like trying to take an ocean and pour it into a thimble. You can't summarize how it feels inside a marriage for someone else without being reductive.
Well,
right?
Yeah. And so I'm so glad you talked about putting an ocean into a thimble, because one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was, you said this wise thing to me once. You've said many wise things to me, but this thing where you were like, trying to understand somebody else's marriage is like dipping your toe in an ocean and like thinking somehow you could understand the ocean through that toe dip. And in this situation, it's almost inverted, because as opposed to, so many times for Ask Polly, maybe like you were dipping your toe into the ocean of like somebody else's life, somebody else's marriage, somebody else's shit stuff. And
stuff.
And I guess I'm wondering, like, when you are essentially creating a book that is inviting readers to dip a toe in the ocean of your marriage, like a curated, constructed, narrated version of the ocean of your marriage, how do you think about making that ocean something comprehensible, like on every level? Like, how do you choose which scenes to bring us into? Like, how do you choose which details about your husband are going to construct him as a character on the page? Like, how do you choose those details about yourself? Like, how do you take that infinitude and start making it stuff that we can feel and experience and, in whatever partial way feel like we've lived inside of.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, I tend to pinpoint places, it's emotional. I mean, everything I've ever written is always driven by the emotion, whether I was writing like a 6 Feet Under review or a cartoon. My best writing has always been driven by sort of passion and emotions. There are days when you wake up and you say, I just feel so angry. And there's the kind of non-productive anger where you're like, I just want to sit around feeling angry, feeling mad about things without writing it down. And then there's the clarifying anger that makes you passionately walk toward, flesh it out. Like you want to embody what it is that's wrong. And you want to prove that you have a right almost to your emotion. I mean, that can be, I think that's probably for some baggage related reasons is a compulsion of mine to want to be understood and to want to explain why I feel the way I feel and why it's justified to feel that way. But I think so. Basically, I just jump off a cliff, into a moment that stands out, and 9 times out of 10, it's a moment that reflects poorly on me. It's a moment that often reflects well on my husband Bill, or reflects slightly poorly on him, or we're not connecting, or there's some shadowy humiliation in the picture often, or there's just a disconnecting. Sometimes it's what appeals to me is an extreme moment. I mean, everyone in a marriage understands this. That extreme moment. I just made a sweeping statement. Why did I do that? I need to stop making. Anyway,
more to say about sweeping statements in a bit
later on.
I think they have their uses.
Yeah, bookmark that for later. But there's a way that when you dive in and you're trying to say to someone else, okay, so in my book, I walk in the door and it's the first time I left the house and left the baby with my husband. And I was proud of myself for leaving, because I was like, I said to myself, I'm not going to be a control freak who hovers over her baby. I've been doing that for, 2 months. And now it's time for me to go out and have lunch, and I'm going to come, or I guess it was dinner, and then I'm going to come back and it's going to be fine. And I walk in the door and my husband is holding the baby on his, it was hard to describe this, but he was holding the baby on his forearm. So her limbs were dangling like this. Her head was sort of face down in his palm, and her limbs, she was just like this, like a chicken. And he's stirring a pot of mac and cheese with his other hand. And my stepson,
here's like the boiling water.
Yeah, the boiling water, like right over the boiling water. He's holding the chicken over the pot. And my stepson, and they're laughing and gesturing, laughing. And I walk in and I say, what am I looking at right now? And he says, calm down immediately. Like that was he doesn't really even make the sounds now because we've been together for so long. It's like he knows my triggers. But when you take a moment like that, where two people absolutely don't understand each other at all, and when you're approaching with, you like, all I'm doing is pointing out to you that what I'm seeing here is completely unacceptable, and of course you're going to agree with me. And the response is, I can tell you that what I'm seeing here is unacceptable, and you need to stop feeling irrational emotions around something completely reasonable that I'm doing with our baby over a pot of boiling water. And really, we each did have a case, but what it comes down to is like, how do you navigate that? How do you communicate with someone who's on the far side of the sea from you. And you have to do all the swimming just to get there. And both people are already mad. The conversation starts and you're both angry.
Yeah.
So, and you can love the person. At that moment in the book, I say, this was the moment where I could see my life going in two directions, where if I couldn't explain this, I was going to feel my childhood was going to be my marriage. I was going to feel like a lonely kid in her bedroom through my whole marriage, and that's not a trivial, it's not a trivial choice. And yet we land in different places in a marriage. A lot of marriages end based on that one kind of moment.
Totally. And the maybe the accumulation too of like the emotional reality that all of those moments are creating. And I think one of the things I love is the way that you narrate these moments, the like coming back to the kitchen, the road trip moments, the moments of irritation and small pleasure and correction, because it's like so much of what can feel frustrating about trying to talk about relationships is that the arguments that feel like they were everything, that changed everything, when you try to translate them into language for other people, it's like, well, there was this thing with the receipts, and then he was like texting when I was talking, they sound so banal, but then everybody who's ever been in a relationship is like, yes, like the biggest like most hurt inner children in us are totally rising up to meet the banality of these moments. And they're occasions for the most important emotional stuff that happens between two people. But what you do in this book is you like show us the stakes of what is happening in those, in those arguments that are about, I mean, not even all of them on their surface seem, banal, but it's like the idea that the big stakes are always operative in every moment. And you sort of take us inside of that, but it's always so real and so funny that it never feels like the kind of ponderousness of like everything was at stake at that moment. But you're also kind of like, no, like a lot is at stake in that moment. And I think, one thing I wanted to ask you about was like how you construct some of those intense emotional conversation scenes, because one of the things I think you do as a writer that I just don't see very often, and it feels like oxygen, is like you really take us beat by beat through complicated emotional conversations. It's not like a single note. It's not like and that's actually what it is. Like every emotional conversation has like chapters, and this moment where the people are kind of coming together, and then a moment where somebody says something and it's like, oh no, like we're back in our corners again. And you really, I just wonder how you think about almost like dramatizing as if it were its own little short story or a plot line, the kind of back and forth that happens in those really charged moments. Like how do the two people on their opposite sides of the ocean, how do you tell us the story of them kind of swimming against the currents of themselves to reach each other?
I mean, I think that, okay, so just to be clear, the whole book isn't about people arguing, you know what I mean? Like, for people who are listening, it's, part of the challenge of this book was I wanted to show the things that were funny and trivial. And I wanted to show also arguments that get filtered through mundane, trivial things. But when you're in that, when I'm, basically I would just start writing down what I remembered us talking about. I remember, it's interesting how, obviously as a memoirist, there are times when you write things that are sort of an approximation of what the core feeling was. With that one conversation about holding the baby over the pot, I remember so many beats of that conversation because it felt like such a breakthrough. And it doesn't, I mean, part of my objective with that scene in the book was to explain how important it is. I mean, it's strange because the book isn't prescriptive, even though I write an advice column. It's really a story, but it was really important to me to pinpoint this moment when I took kind of a stand in a very careful, gentle way. I think that what I've seen through Ask Polly and what I've seen from my friends is that when people don't feel empowered to make a stand. And granted, there are relationships where you can't make a stand because you're never being heard, and you already know that. But when you take the chance to believe that, I mean, so much of marriage is about believing, trusting, taking a leap of faith that you can explain what's happening at the core of your being, even if you can't get the other person to see it as rational or useful or pragmatic. If you can explain the feeling of it, and for me, it's like, I need a metaphor usually. You know, like I remember saying to Bill, it doesn't matter, like you're holding my liver over a boiling pot when you hold the baby. This baby was inside me for 9 months. I was trying to say, when you're, you know, I don't know how to tell you how fragile it feels to walk in and see that. It's like a crisis, you know, and sometimes you're just, you know, so it's so important to notice your physical reaction, right? Because when you're like, I'm panicked.
I'm actually having a physical reaction just to imagining this. Yeah.
I'm panicking. I mean, Bill and I actually now, because we're pretty good at navigating bad moments, say to each other, I feel panicked. You know, in therapy, in just regular I was in couples therapy with an old boyfriend who it was never gonna work. And that's often when you land in couples therapy, when you already know it's not gonna work. But they always said, use I statements, like, I feel sad, you know, but actually, I'm physically panicking,
right.
is actually more direct in some ways, because it's like, I don't know what I can't put a name on this emotion.
Right.
You know, I mean, when you're both in that spot, I can't name where I am. I'm just, and the thing about this, the thing that I wanted wanted to communicate in this book more than anything else was, I wanted to communicate the feeling of I'm failing, because panicking is partially just, I'm going to fail at this, you know, I don't think I can reach you. And that's how it feels when you see someone who says, calm down, and you're like, I can't, you know, I'm going to fail. Yeah. It's like, I mean, and I would say there are at least like 3 or 4 chapters in this book that start off or reach a point where the guiding emotion is where Bill and I are both saying, oh no, we're going to fail. But in some ways, if you look at that through a merciful lens, it's kind of beautiful. Yeah. You know, because when you're willing to admit, oh my God, we're both feel like we're failing, that's where you meet, you know, that's where there's a possibility of love and passion and connection. Yeah.
And there's almost, I mean, it rings so true for me, that sense of like becoming so embattled and unguarded and almost calcified in an argument, and how the thing that can shift it is if you just somehow can soften to each other again. And sometimes the way that softening can happen is precisely by saying, I literally can't even describe what's happening inside of me, but I feel so I can't move, panicked, and I, you know, and I think, you know, well, okay, so many questions from what you just said, but one of them, and it may be especially around the very true statement that it's a book that has some arguments in it, but also many other infinitudes. And one of my like personal preoccupations is just like the difficulty, but also kind of glorious necessity of trying to write happiness, and how happiness sometimes just feels so much harder to write than friction and sorrow. And I wonder how, knowing that you set out to write this book as, among other things, an antidote to sort of like unrealistic, sugar-coated versions of marriage, I'm curious how you approach the task of writing happiness in your marriage, like a happiness that was not sugar-coated, but is very real and like very palpable in here as well.
I think that my weakness sometimes, I would say that at first, when I was trying to write about happiness, I really didn't like doing it, because it felt like, you know, I mean, and maybe I've just been writing directly for people in such a kind of personal way through the advice column for so long, and that I just, I don't, but it's also my experience of nonfiction. I don't like reading nonfiction that feels like the point of the book is to prove that the author is incredible. I mean, and it's not like there are tons of books that fit that bill, but there are ways that people gently manipulate the picture to just remind us that they're amazing and that things are good for them and that everyone is attracted to them and loves them, and they're,
just erasing this manuscript on my computer right now.
Yeah. Yes, get rid, throw in the trash. And I think that, I obviously have a taste for books that are the opposite of that, that are sort of like, show me your lowest moments, almost to a fault. But it felt particularly I did not set out to write a book that glorified my marriage. That just feels, to me, it's not just, I talk about how in our culture people are very moralistic about marriage. I'm moralistic about writing tales that make me seem better than I am.
Yeah.
The irony of some of the reaction to the book is that people misapprehended some of my intentions and actually believed that I was I can be vainglorious. It's not that I can't celebrate myself. Lord knows I do it, but I'm making fun of myself in scenes where I say, I am being so good. I am being so patient. I'm laughing at myself. I can't imagine putting out something that, obviously you want the reader to enjoy you. But I felt a revulsion around making my marriage seem better than it was. I wanted, and in some ways I fell off a cliff because why did I sell a book about my marriage? I asked myself, why did I do this thing? And if my point is to prove that my marriage isn't better than anyone else's, it was almost like I was stress testing my marriage while I was writing about my marriage, which I do not recommend to anyone. It was it was really a nutty thing to do. But I don't know, to answer your question, I think what I had to do was I had to write some of the rough stuff first. It was an unfortunate that the book began with me falling in love with my husband. And that's why I ended up writing. Falling in love with someone, watching someone else falling in love is like watching them eat a submarine sandwich. The more they're enjoying it, the more grossed out you are. And you're like, take that sandwich somewhere else and, get it out of our faces. We don't want to see this. So I was attracted to the rough moments and the conflict. But then I had to go back into the book. There are places where it wasn't the fullness of my feelings were, all the colors of the spectrum were not there.
Yeah.
I had filled in too much of this.
Yeah.
Or there was a version of the wedding chapter that was too panicked.
Yeah.
It was just all manic. This is all bad, and then one of the downsides of being good at persuasive writing and good at writing scenes that are dramatic is that you overdo it,
right?
And you have to pull back and say, and you really need a good editor,
right. Well, and I do, one of the things that I'm really eager to ask you about is how this book changed between drafts and what you kind of had, either through your conversations with editors or your own eye or Bill's eye or whoever. It's like how it evolved and how you sort of had to correct against certain tendencies. But as you were talking a little bit about watching somebody eat a submarine sandwich, and I was thinking too, I think one of the things that does make, at least for me as a reader, the happiness in the book work so well is that you often are doing this kind of process of inversion or juxtaposition where there are sometimes hard moments where we might expect to find, at least according to Hollywood, glorious moments like a proposal or, and then there are actually really beautiful moments of happiness where we wouldn't necessarily expect to find them. Like the flights are canceled, you're in a car with the dogs and the kids and you're going across the country. And it's actually, that's like one of the most, to me, in my mind, like one of the most beautiful kind of extended happiness scenes. But it's like, it's like we've watched you claw your way through the dirt to find the submarine sandwich. And then we're like, yes, like eat it, enjoy it. I'll watch you, you know, love it. But it has something to do with honoring both the surprise of like, yeah, we actually don't find happiness in these moments when like the script tells us we're going to. It's these like weird in between moments where it sort of finds us anyway, or we have to actually kind of work to create it where it wasn't readily accessible, you know? So
I mean, it's interesting when you were talking about that, I was thinking, oh yeah, Bill and I actually have a shared thing where if the expectations are high, we start to pant like nervous dogs. And then we piss all over the place, unfortunately. And you know,
another scene in the book. Yeah.
I mean, I think, and then when expectations are low, you know, you're trapped in a minivan in the middle of Texas, and you look out the window and it says, "This is the home of George W. Bush, Jr." George W. W is Junior.
George H.
Midland, Texas. Anyway, we were in a traffic jam in the middle of Texas and nothing was moving. And it's one of those things where you look at your phone and it's just red for 2 miles unexpectedly out on the prairie or whatever. And one of my dependents, I mean, I was very careful in how I wrote this scene so that no one would be too embarrassed. But there was a dependent in the car that needed to defecate, and there was nothing to hide behind, even by the side of the road. And so we had to improvise. And it was like a peak moment of my life that we managed to pull off this horrible, you know, you're just in this situation. I mean, never are you in more sort of like depraved situations than you are with little kids, you know, the chaos of that. And there's a way that we talk about like kids mess up your life and they make things crazy, but we don't, because we're so embarrassed about our marriages and so paranoid about seeming to anyone else like we don't have perfect marriages, or that our marriages are just as happy as most marriages. You know, people are sort of like, they feed you this like, we're pretty good. It's pretty just an average marriage, you know, which is interesting because our culture is all about being exceptional and the individual. And yet the marriage needs to be this, it's perfectly fine. And there's unconditional love and we're good. It's just shrouded in nothingness, the way we talk about it. And so being able to say, my marriage is both terrible, you know, and sometimes it feels like it's transcendent, you know, like that's a good sign. Actually, it's a sign that you have two passionate people who are showing up and, you know, expressing their emotions to each other. And really there are many people who just don't like to talk about their marriages and don't actually like to talk to their spouses that much. And I would just argue that that's it's a difficult place to be. I mean, I do think, okay, so a therapist would say, yeah, but some people just are like that. Like you have two avoidant people and they function rather well and that's how they want to. And I kind of, as I've gotten older, I see marriages like that from the outside. I don't have no idea what's going on the inside. And I'm sort of more like, oh, that functions. Like these are two people who want that. And that's good. You know, I'm more and more of the mind of, oh, you know, everybody just designs their marriage by themselves. It's like you make this artisanal world that suits the two of you. And you don't need to translate it to other people necessarily, but people misapprehend what it is constantly.
Well, and I think sometimes for me, I sometimes have experienced even a kind of radical excitement about like the different ways a marriage or a partnership can look, that I think comes from having had a pretty suffocatingly cloistered sense of what romantic intimacy had to look like in my 20s, which was basically just like two people with like almost like with feeding tubes who just sat there and did nothing but talk about their feelings like all day long, and like probably didn't have jobs. That it's just like total articulated emotional connection was what intimacy had to be. And then I think that didn't work for me enough times that I then came to this place where I was like, I'm actually so excited about all the ways it can look nothing like what my ideal was, or it could look avoidant and it works for you. Like, great, and I maybe the answer is somewhere between those, but I also kind of identify with that feeling of like, oh, like this thing that I don't need to identify with this thing or even fully understand this thing to kind of marvel at the way that it might be functional for these two other people.
Can I just interrupt and say, it's interesting because there's this interplay, the irony of being more open to the fact that people who are very different and function in different ways. Like that's kind of a sign of maturity that you can accept that everyone is different, right? But the irony of being open to that is actually it creates more openness and takes you out of a cloistered space in your marriage. And that some of the things that, I guess what I want to say is some of the things that make a marriage better are things that are a threat to the marriage.
Mm-hmm.
You open yourself up to the world.
Yeah.
And, for a while, I have this chapter that's about a crush. And for a while, I wrote about it in this very defensive way where I was like, don't worry, I'm not going to ever do anything. I'm not leaving my husband, where I just didn't even, it was not completely truthful. It wasn't very honest. It was like, I don't know what's happening, but don't worry. I'm so married, never going to do anything bad. And then I had to write about it in this way that was more honest, which was like, oh no, this is a threat in some ways. It's not that I'm trying to feed this crazy thing. It just is important to me.
Mm-hmm.
I've discovered something new that's important to me and I don't know why. And I have these feelings that are important to me and I have no idea where to put them or how to classify them. Yeah. And yet that energy brings like some passion to the picture. And it's not just that like you're saying, it's not, we tend to kind of reduce it to like, oh yeah, you wanted to cheat and that was dirty and you brought some dirty energy in. No, it's actually you're opening up this part of yourself that says, oh my God, I think I want something else. It's not want someone else. It's like, I want a new feeling. I don't want a person. I want a new feeling.
Yeah.
And when you can dare to be vulnerable enough to say, oh, I found this thing that gives me this feeling. And I know better than to say, it's this person and I love this person. When I know enough to say, I have this route to feeling now. And I want to map it out and talk to you about it. Suddenly things get kind of electric because you're like, where are we?
Yeah.
We're two different people who want, all the cloisteredness of we're here to preserve the marriage. All your energy can't be going into the most important thing is that we stay together until one of us dies.
Right. Well, and you redirect the energy from like
TikTok,
from preservation to change or evolution, which preservation of the marriage is a very particular kind of language. It's like, we have to stay like this.
Let's stay
how
right
we
here.
Are.
Don't open the window.
Yeah, totally. It's because, like,
you could see something.
And then you have, like a breeze or you have the new feeling. The East River.
I smell something really good out there. The East River, it's just the East River, Heather.
But and I think, when you were talking earlier about the kind of bringing in the full spectrum of feelings or seeing certain scenes where you hadn't get brought in the full spectrum of feelings, or even like are finding a way to speak about the marriage where it's like sometimes it feels terrible and sometimes it feels transcendent. That's also a way of saying, I want to talk about the marriage in a way that holds the whole spectrum of feelings. And I would be curious, just like in a writer geek kind of way,
instead of talking about it like it's a problem, which we have a bad habit of talking about marriage is like, we've got this problem to solve.
Right.
It's not perfect. Let's fix this.
Right.
As opposed to, where are we? What's this strange aurora that we're moving through.
Yeah. And how might it like be the way that we get to something that feels
good
different
for both of
yeah,
us.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder just in an kind of an editing way, like how you like talk to us a little bit about that process of like looking at a draft of this book. What did you see that felt incomplete or like skewed too much towards one set of feelings and not enough towards another? Or like what were the ways that you looked at drafts of this book and were like, I'm too much like this as a character and I need to bring out these truths of myself, or Bill is too much like this as a character and I need to bring out these truths of him? Like what was that revision? So much of writing to me happens in revision that I wonder what that held for you.
Well, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think it's like the first draft is almost like a map of your defenses.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you dive in, but you use all your terrible tools. You know, you use all of your, you know, I'm an idiot, you know, and some of the stuff is a legitimate part of I'm an idiot is kind of part of my personality, like for better or for worse. And it's not really even a defense anymore. It's kind of calcified, but you know, I'm a big dummy. Oh, he's an idiot too. And we're just, the first draft was very defensive and it was very negative. It was kind of like too negative about Bill. I just had to get that draft out. Mm-hmm. And I was so suspicious of saying, no, but I love him. He's amazing. You know, even though that's how I did, but I both thought that and felt it, mm-hmm. you know, but I wasn't able to, look, the book took a long time to polish. And just to toot my own horn, I think that, you know, it turned out great because there were a lot of edits. It wasn't like there was, I thought that the first draft was actually close to the finished book. Structurally, it was. I wrote the whole thing and sent it's interesting to write a lot of different books. I used to turn in books piecemeal. Mm-hmm. This book, I wrote a whole draft. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it was essays. And I said, I don't want this to be essays. This is a story. Mm-hmm. It needs to be a story. And all this interesting stuff went down while I was writing it. And I was like, this is the end of the story.
Yeah.
I deal with health issues. My relationship is challenged by an outside force beyond my control, completely beyond my control. And so, but because of COVID and because there were all these delays, and in fact, I started with one editor and the book was passed to another editor, the book kept improving because I would approach it with fresh eyes. A new editor came in. There were so many opportunities and the thing is, when you're a younger writer and less experienced, you think, oh, they want so much in this edit. And when you're older and you have a lot of experience, you're actually like, oh, it's just a little turn, you know. Yeah. It's like you know, it was there, mm-hmm. and a few things needed one sentence, mm-hmm. a slight reframing, mm-hmm. you know. And then you get into this, change that word, and and when you're doing that, you're like, that's when you feel good. Yeah. When you're like, this is working, and I'm changing one word, and it makes it a little better. Like I love that.
Well, and sometimes when you're writing about your own life, it can be as simple as like this sentence that's so self-evident that lives inside of you, but can be actually totally pivotal to add and make available to the reader. And then it totally shifts the way. It's like
there's connective tissue suddenly.
You put a little bit of pressure there and it actually makes the plank go. I'm using a physics metaphor that I don't understand at all, but you put a little.
What are we building? I like it though. I like that.
Well, okay. I know we're going to have some questions for the audience in a couple minutes, but one thing I did want to ask, which is really related to that question of process, and I imagine probably some other people are wondering about it as well, but I'm curious, like what role Bill played in the writing of the book. Like, did he read manuscripts? Were you talking about your respective memories of different things you were narrating? Like, what was you guys do have so much kind of conversational openness in your relationship that I wonder what that looked like around the writing of the book itself.
Oh, I mean, sadly, it was like, Bill would come upstairs to my office and say like, okay, I'm going to go walk the dogs. And I'd say, and he'd say, oh, what's going on? And I'd say like, I'm writing this chapter about babies, and I don't know, babies are boring, like I'm not writing about them in a way that's as interesting as, babies aren't boring, but the chapter is boring, but you experience it when you're not writing well as, this is a stupid subject. It's not me. It's just that, and Bill would say, oh, like it was granular. In other words, there were times when I'd say, can you read this? And there are other times when I was like, I can't have you read this until I figure it out.
Yeah.
Generally, he would read, I'm trying to think. I think he read like 4 or 5 chapters at a time in the beginning, and then he'd weigh in. But it wasn't, Bill is not someone who says, yeah, this, I don't like the tone of this. He's very kind of, wow, he's he's so welcoming about the way I could paint a scene in 2 different ways, totally with opposite kinds of emotional propulsion in each scene. And he'd say, ooh, that was sad. And then he'd say, oh, that was a fun time. Like he gets into my words a lot, which is what the amazing thing to have in a spouse.
Yeah.
He's into it. And so, and the only time when I really change things is when he says, yeah, it was good, and he's obviously not into it.
Right.
Then I'm like, I did not do my job.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he was intimately involved in so many different levels.
Yeah.
I mean, there were times when we'd have a totally macro talk about our marriage that was just spawned from some chapter I was working on. I mean, it was just like constantly stress testing our communication. And, I think we both we were sort of like more and more at peace with what I had made.
Yeah.
As it got better.
Well, and I love too that like, I think there can be a way that people talk about writing about other people in their lives, or, especially people who are close to us, as if it was sort of always an act, always a bit destructive. And the question is just how to minimize the damage or whatever. Yeah. But I think it's important to talk about these other functions that can serve, like that it's launching these conversations about your marriage that are really illuminating. Like it can, not to be a Pollyanna about it, because it can go 1,000 ways to write about people with whom you share your life. But like sometimes it actually can deepen both people's understanding of the other person's experience. And
Absolutely.
I think it's worth telling those stories too. So
well, that was definitely my experience. I mean, I felt like and I think Bill would say the same thing. He's I mean, we talk, it's almost like we've had a wedding now where we're kind of like, the book is the wedding and the wedding is over, and we're kind of like, wow, we did that. I mean, I think Bill feels like he was almost a partner in making the book I mean, he's the star of the book. Hi, Lonnie.
Hi. And you probably have a freezer full of like the leftover capon from the entree at the reception.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, there's a frozen cake in my freezer now, and we'll shove it into each other's mouths soon.
It always bothers me at wedding receptions, that shoving and the let's make a mess of the face. I don't understand it, but that's a different topic for another day. So everyone, we are at 7:55. We're going to get to just a couple questions here, but I want to give a little bit of a surprise and delight to our attendees. You've been seeing in chat, if you haven't had chat open, you might want to open it now. Fans got a little bit of fun for everyone, and for Heather in particular, probably, which is that we've been putting in, after hours is starting at, well, actually technically 8:05. We give these nice ladies a couple minutes break after we close this down. After hours, you usually get into after hours by buying a copy of the book from the bookstall, which is true. And there's the link in chat right now. Fan wants to support this book in a big way. We think that lots of people, not just you, but also your cousin and your daughter and your mom and your sister and your aunt and your uncle can all benefit from this book. So what we're going to do is buy a copy from the bookstall. And when you come into after hours at 8:05, when we let you in, we're going to give you a link to fill out a little form, and Fan's going to buy you another book. So it's a twofer. So buy a book from the bookstall, and there's going to be a second book that will come winging its way to your home. So do you understand that? buy a book, come to After Hours, and you'll get a second book at After Hours. So what a deal. I mean, what a deal. Great conversation. I mean, that's so much to say, so I'll just save it for After Hours. Beautiful. Leslie, thank you so much. Such great energy on the sofa. We love it. So let's jump into a couple questions. And I think you only have a limited time here, so let's go kind of quick. One quick question people want to know. Two people want to know, who do you intend as the reader, Heather, of the book? Are you thinking singles, married couples? What are you thinking? Did you have an intended reader?
I tend to think of, in my mind as I'm writing, of a reader as being someone who is capable of understanding me and is almost like a future friend, right? Or a current friend. And so that encompasses, I mean, I think that the book will appeal to, I have heard from single people who've read it and they say it gave them faith that, that they could love and be loved, people who are really looking for that. I'm not alleging that all single people want to be in a monogamous long-term relationship. I don't recommend it to all single people. But the people who do want that, I think that the idea, part of it is that if someone as weird and messed up as me can pull this off, a lot of people can. It's just a matter of prying your heart open as wide as it will humanly go, sometimes through sweat and force. But I also think obviously, I feel very strongly that, and I've seen, it appeals to people who've been married for a while and people who've been married. I mean, it probably is the most scary to people who are about to get married.
Maybe.
Or just been married.
One thing I do want to reflect, though, for everyone is that this book is extremely funny. I mean, it is laughing out loud on the sofa. You start laughing like, I mean, Heather, you write with great wit generally, and this book is certainly not exempt from that. So I want to underscore that. There is a quick question. Can you say a few words about the cover? It was there in terms of, someone says is it a throwback? It reminds them of like a 50s or the 40s picture, a Varga pinup. Is she a femme fatale, a smart, conniving woman? Can you say a few words about the cover?
Well, she's a little bored, I think. And yet she's sort of enjoying her position. I mean, I found that illustration online. We had a few other covers that we were looking at, and Echo's been great, very flexible and very open to my good and terrible ideas. But I found that illustration, I felt like it really captured a lot of different things. She's satisfied and she's dissatisfied. She's very secure and she looks great, but she's also a little, who's that over there? I mean, I think there's a little bit of ambivalence in the cover that I liked. And I also think that all marriages at some level are set in the 50s. So because the concept is in some ways a little archaic. And so I liked the fact that it felt slightly arcane and strange and old and outdated.
All right, well, we're at 8 o'clock. I'm going to let you go ahead and close us out with anything that you want to say as a wrap up, either to Leslie, to the audience in general, and then everybody. We're going to open up After Hours at about 8:05. We're going to let Heather and Leslie have a few minutes to get there, have a drink of water and go to the bathroom. So Heather, how would you like to close out?
Well, I just want to say thank you to Leslie, who's incredible. Thank you to everyone who came and listened to us on our strange hotel couch. And Fan is my favorite event. Really, I mean, I've done a few events with Fan. I did one for What If This Were Enough, my last book. I interviewed Melissa Phoebos, her amazing book. And I just want to say thank you to Fan. I can't believe you bought an extra copy for everyone that's insane. I cannot imagine. It's like a dream. And of course, Lonnie, I enjoy you and think you're great. And Fan, really, they know what all authors who are listening, this is the cream of the crop.
Fan's the best.
You're so sweet. All right. Well, I promised everyone that 8 o'clock meant 8 o'clock, and now it's 8:01.
Oops.
Trains have to run on time. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Stay tuned. We got a lot of great programming